The man inside. The KGB spy who infiltrated the CIA for 9 years. The true story of Aldrich Ames, America's most devastating mole. Imagine waking up one morning in a comfortable house in suburban Virginia, driving a brand new Jaguar, wearing tailored clothes that your government salary should never be able to afford. You walk into one of the most secretive buildings in the world, a place whose very address was once classified. Badge yourself through security clearances that most Americans will never possess. Sit down at your desk surrounded by the most sensitive intelligence files in existence and smile. Because you know something that none of your colleagues know. You know exactly who has been feeding information to the enemy. You know which Soviet officials have been working as informants for the United States government. While you know which operations are active, which agents are running, which lives hang in the balance of a single telephone call. You know all of this because you are the one who told the other side. This is the story of Aldrich Hazen Ames, a man known to his colleagues simply as Rick, a career CIA officer who for 9 uninterrupted years fed the most precious secrets of American intelligence directly to the KGB. His actions led to the arrest and execution of at least 10 people. He dismantled virtually the entire network of Soviet agents working for the United States. He received over $2.5 million in payment. And he did all of this not out of ideological conviction, not out of coercion, not out of blackmail, but because he wanted a bigger house, a more expensive car, and a lifestyle that his government paycheck simply could not support. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence would later call the Ames case the most devastating espionage case in our nation's history. That is not hyperbole. What Aldrich Ames did to the CIA from the inside over nearly a decade constitutes one of the most catastrophic intelligence betrayals any nation has ever suffered at the hands of one of its own. Before we go deeper into this astonishing story, if you're finding this as gripping as it truly was in real life, subscribe to this channel right now and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story like this one. We cover the most incredible true stories from the shadowy world of espionage, Cold War secrets, and the hidden history that shaped our world. Don't miss what comes next. Let's go back to the beginning. To understand how Aldrich Ames became the most damaging mole in CIA history, you have to understand where he came from. He was born on May 26, 1941, in River Falls, Wisconsin, a small, unremarkable college town in the American Midwest. His father, Carlton Ames, was an academic who had taught at the local teachers' college and who later made a fateful career change. He joined the Central Intelligence Agency's Directorate of Operations in 1952. When Rick was just 12 years old, his father received a posting to Burma, and the entire family relocated to Southeast Asia. For 3 years, young Aldrich grew up watching his father navigate the clandestine world, though Carlton Ames, ironically, was never considered a particularly distinguished intelligence officer. But he struggled with alcoholism, a family trait that would prove catastrophic in his son's story, and received largely negative performance appraisals throughout his career in the field. By the time the family returned to the United States and settled in the suburbs of Northern Virginia, near CIA headquarters in Langley, Aldrich Ames was a teenager, absorbing the culture of the intelligence community from the inside. He attended McLean High School in McLean, Virginia, a town that might as well have been called CIA Town. So many of its residents worked, in one capacity or another, for the agency. Beginning in 1957, during his sophomore year, Rick took a summer job at the CIA itself, working as a low-ranking records analyst through a program designed to give employment to the children of CIA employees. He was good-looking, uncharming in a quiet way, and possessed of an easy intelligence. But from the very beginning, there were signs of the man he would become. He was careless with details. He was prone to indulgence. And he had already begun developing a relationship with alcohol that would shadow him for the rest of his life. After high school, Ames enrolled at the University of Chicago and promptly failed out after 2 years, his grades insufficient to keep him enrolled. He drifted for a while, working as an assistant technical director at a Chicago theater, before returning to Washington in 1962 and taking a full-time job at the CIA as a clerk. It was a modest beginning. He was doing clerical work, filing documents, performing the administrative grunt work of a massive bureaucracy. But the CIA was in his blood, quite literally. And the agency, and despite everything, despite his mediocre grades, his alcohol-related brushes with the law, his unstable early life, was willing to give him a chance. In 1962, Aldrich Ames began what would become a 31-year career with the Central Intelligence Agency. While working full-time at Langley, he attended George Washington University on a part-time basis, grinding through his coursework until he finally earned a bachelor's degree in history in 1967, with a B- average. It was not a distinguished academic record, but it was enough. That same year, the CIA accepted him into its career trainee program, the gateway to becoming a full-fledged operations officer. Here, young candidates were trained in the dark arts of human intelligence, how to recruit foreign assets, how to handle informants, how to conduct surveillance, and how to maintain cover. Ames placed low in psychological evaluations for the work. There were questions, even then, about his suitability for the high-pressure, high-stakes world of field operations. But he completed his training with stronger-than-expected marks, and the CIA, always hungry for officers who could speak Russian and navigate the complex world of Soviet counterintelligence, decided to take a chance on him. In 1969, Rick Ames married a fellow CIA officer named Nancy Segabarth, whom he had met during his training. The couple were promptly dispatched to Ankara, Turkey, his first overseas posting. His assignment there was to recruit Soviet intelligence officers as double agents to find Russians who could be turned, persuaded, or pressured into working secretly for the Americans. So it was exactly the kind of assignment where a charming, personable officer could thrive. And Ames did achieve some successes. He managed to infiltrate a communist student organization by developing relationships with people connected to Soviet-aligned activists. But his overall performance reviews from Ankara were underwhelming. His station chief, the legendary Duane Claridge, assessed Ames bluntly. He was unsuited for field work and would be better placed behind a desk at headquarters. It was a damning verdict, and Ames knew it. He returned to CIA headquarters in 1972, bruised by the assessment, but determined to stay in the game. He was assigned to the Soviet East European Division, known internally as the SE Division, the heart of the CIA's Cold War operations against the Soviet Union. Here, so working in analysis and asset management rather than field recruitment, Ames performed considerably better. His performance reviews were generally enthusiastic, according to agency records. He was good at what he did when what he did involved reading files, synthesizing intelligence, and managing relationships with assets at a safe remove. But his heavy drinking continued to be noted in internal memoranda. 2 eyes-only memos were placed in his file about his alcohol use, a warning sign that would be overlooked repeatedly in the years to come. The Cold War of the 1970s was a period of extraordinary tension and extraordinary espionage. The CIA and the KGB were engaged in a shadow war that played out in every corner of the globe, in the embassies of European capitals, in the back streets of Beirut, in the jungles of Southeast Asia, in the corridors of the United Nations in New York. Each side was constantly probing the other for weaknesses, trying to recruit insiders, trying to identify the moles and double agents that they knew, with near certainty, were burrowed deep within their own organizations. In 1976, Ames was assigned to New York City, where he handled two of the CIA's most important Soviet assets. The first was Sergei Fedorenko, a Soviet nuclear weapons expert attached to the Soviet mission to the United Nations, who provided American intelligence with critical information about the Soviet missile program. The second was Arkady Shevchenko, a Soviet diplomat who would ultimately become the highest-ranking Soviet official ever to defect to the West. These were exactly the kinds of high-value, high-stakes relationships that defined the intelligence community's most important work. And yet, throughout this period, Ames's personal life was quietly unraveling. His marriage to Nancy was in trouble. The strains of CIA life, his drinking, and his emotional detachment had taken their toll. In 1981, he was posted to Mexico City, where he would spend 2 years working the Latin American beat, while his marriage to Nancy crumbled toward divorce. And it was in Mexico City that Aldrich Ames met the woman who would become his second wife, and ultimately his accomplice in the most catastrophic act of betrayal in CIA history. Her name was Maria del Rosario Casas Dupuy, and she was a Colombian national working as a cultural attaché at the Colombian embassy in Mexico City. The CIA had recruited her as an asset, a source of information about Colombian political circles. When Ames was assigned to handle her as an informant, the professional relationship quickly became personal. She was sophisticated, cosmopolitan, well-educated, and possessed of expensive tastes. She liked designer clothes, fine restaurants, elegant homes. She lived the life of someone accustomed to a certain level of material comfort, a level that Rick Ames's CIA salary was entirely incapable of providing. Ames's divorce from Nancy was finalized, and in 1985, the same year that would mark his most fateful decision, he married Rosario. By that point, she had stopped working for the CIA. But she was well aware of his professional world, his access, his position. And when the financial pressure of their lifestyle, the debts, the demands, and the ever-widening gap between what they earned and what they spent became unbearable, Rosario was not merely a passive bystander to what came next. By early 1985, Aldrich Ames was in serious financial trouble. His divorce from Nancy had been costly. He was supporting Rosario, whose family in Colombia expected financial assistance. He had run up significant credit card debt, and he was living, or trying to live, in a manner that his government salary, around $60,000 a year, simply could not sustain. He was desperate. He was angry. And he was in a position that almost no one in the world was in. He was the chief of the Soviet counterintelligence branch of the CIA's Directorate of Operations, which meant he had access, as he would later describe it, to virtually everything the CIA knew about its Soviet operations. For he knew the identities of American agents within the Soviet intelligence services. He knew the details of ongoing operations. He had the keys, in effect, to the most sensitive vault in American intelligence, and he decided to sell what was inside. On April 16, 1985, Aldrich Ames walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. He asked for a KGB officer he knew to be the senior intelligence presence at the embassy, Sergei Chuvakin, ostensibly a diplomat specializing in arms control. Ames handed an envelope to the duty officer at the reception desk, addressed to the most senior KGB officer in the building. Inside the envelope was a note. The note read, in effect, "I am Aldrich H. Ames, and my job is branch chief of Soviet counterintelligence at the CIA. I need $50,000, and in exchange, well, here is information about 3 agents we are developing in the Soviet Union right now." He had also attached a page from the CIA's Southeast Europe Division phone directory, with his own name underlined, to prove that he was exactly who he claimed to be. The KGB in Moscow Center must have stared at that envelope in something approaching disbelief. They had just been handed a gift beyond imagining, a sitting chief of Soviet counterintelligence at the Central Intelligence Agency, walking voluntarily through their door, offering to sell them the names of American agents inside the Soviet system. The reaction was swift. The KGB agreed, and $50,000 was quietly deposited to Ames's account. What Ames had initially imagined as a one-time transaction, a desperate, a reckless gamble to solve his immediate financial problems, immediately transformed into something far larger and far more sinister. Because once he had crossed that line, he couldn't step back. He had committed treason. He had given the Soviets names. And now the KGB had leverage over him that no amount of money could ever neutralize. He would later describe his state of mind in those weeks with chilling clarity. My scam was supposed to be a one-time hit, but I had crossed a line, and I could never step back. Less than 2 months later, on June 13, 1985, Ames crossed a line that made the first crossing look trivial. He met with Chuvakhin for lunch, ostensibly a continuation of what the CIA believed was an attempted recruitment of the Soviet diplomat. But what Ames actually brought to that lunch was something that the CIA later described as the largest single transfer of classified intelligence to a hostile power they had ever documented. A package of documents identifying by name every Soviet and Russian national who was secretly working as an informant or asset for the CIA and the FBI. The packet weighed between 5 and 7 pounds. That is how much paper was required to list them all. It identified more than 10 top-level sources. It contained operational details, meeting schedules, the mechanics of dead drops. It was, in a very real sense, a complete inventory of American human intelligence inside the Soviet Union. At the KGB's Moscow center, this package landed like a bomb. Senior KGB officers reviewing the material were, according to later testimony, and stunned by its completeness. A defector who later described the KGB's reaction said that the agency was impressed by the sheer quality and quantity of what Ames had delivered. Viktor Cherkashin, the KGB's senior counterintelligence officer in Washington who personally managed Ames's case, would later describe the moment as a turning point in the intelligence war between the two superpowers. The consequences were immediate, devastating, and irreversible. Beginning in late 1985 and continuing through 1986, CIA assets across the Soviet Union began to disappear. Officers who had been secretly working for the Americans were recalled to Moscow, arrested, interrogated, and in many cases shot. The wave of arrests was so sudden and so comprehensive that it sent shockwaves through CIA headquarters. Within months, at virtually every significant Soviet asset the CIA had developed over years of painstaking, dangerous work was gone. Arrested, executed, or effectively neutralized. The names of those who died because of Aldrich Ames are not all publicly known, but some have been documented in the historical record. General Dmitry Polyakov of the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence, was one of the most valuable American intelligence assets of the entire Cold War. He had been secretly working for the CIA for nearly 20 years, providing information so valuable that the then CIA Director James Woolsey later described him as the jewel in the crown of American human intelligence. Polyakov was arrested in 1986, interrogated at length, and executed in 1988. He was shot, while Major Sergei Motorin was a Soviet intelligence officer at the Washington Residentura, the KGB station embedded within the Soviet embassy. He had been recruited by the FBI and had been providing intelligence about Soviet operations in Washington. Ames gave his name to the KGB. Motorin was recalled to Moscow, arrested, and executed. Colonel Leonid Polishchuk, a KGB counterintelligence officer who had been recruited in Nigeria, was arrested and executed. Gennady Smetanin, a GRU officer who had worked for the CIA and FBI, was killed. Vladimir Pigutsov, a KGB officer who had been spying for the Americans, was executed. Sergei Vorontsov, who had provided intelligence about KGB surveillance techniques, including the revelation that the KGB used an invisible chemical substance known as spy dust to track American officers moving through Moscow, was arrested and executed. In one of the most comprehensive single-session betrayals in the history of espionage, Aldrich Ames had effectively destroyed the CIA's entire human intelligence network inside the Soviet Union. Men and women who had risked everything, their lives, their families, their futures, to provide information to the United States government, were dead. And the man who had killed them was driving a new Jaguar and renovating a $500,000 house in Arlington, Virginia. At CIA headquarters, the scale of the losses was initially incomprehensible. The agency had a term for the phenomenon. They called it going black, meaning the sudden, inexplicable disappearance of active assets. When one or two assets disappear, it can be explained by bad luck, by local circumstances, by the inherent dangers of operating in a police state. But when virtually every single asset goes dark simultaneously, when the entire network collapses in the space of months, there is only one explanation. There is a mole. In late 1986, the CIA assembled a small, secretive team to investigate the source of the catastrophic losses. The team was led by a veteran counterintelligence analyst named Jean Vertefeuille, and it included several other experienced officers who would spend the next several years trying to identify the traitor in their midst. The investigation was codenamed Skylight, and later Play Actor. The team began by identifying what operations had been compromised and working backward to determine who would have had access to all of them. The list of suspects was long, the investigation was agonizingly slow, and the KGB, as it turned out, had thought carefully about how to protect their prize asset. When Ames himself told his KGB handlers that he was worried the wave of arrests would make him a suspect, after all, as chief of Soviet counterintelligence, he was one of a relatively small number of people who would have known the identities of all the compromised assets. The KGB acted to protect him. They constructed an elaborate disinformation operation. A Soviet officer was directed to tell an American contact that the source of the leaks was an officer stationed at the Warrenton Training Center, at a secret CIA communications facility in rural Virginia. This sent investigators off on a year-long wild goose chase. 90 employees at the facility were investigated. None of them was the mole. Meanwhile, Ames continued his work. In 1986, he was posted to Rome, his first overseas assignment in years, and one that gave him continued access to sensitive intelligence while keeping him, ironically, somewhat removed from the direct scrutiny of headquarters. In Rome, he met periodically with KGB handlers. He passed documents. He attended late-night meetings with Soviet intelligence officers, often after consuming, by his own admission, the better part of a bottle of vodka. The Russians would pick him up in cars, sometimes with his baseball cap pulled low over his face, and drive him to locations where they could speak freely. And he was paid regularly, $20,000 to $50,000 per meeting, in cash, deposited into accounts the KGB maintained for him. Back in Washington, $900,000 was sitting in a Moscow bank account waiting for him. His performance in Rome continued to be mediocre. He drank too much. He was frequently late. His administrative work was sloppy. His supervisors noticed, documented their concerns, and continued to promote him anyway. A failure of institutional judgment that would haunt the agency for decades. In 1989, Ames returned to Washington, D.C., and was assigned to the CIA's Counterintelligence Center Analysis Group, giving him access to what internal reports later described as extremely sensitive data, including information on American double agents. It was an astonishing oversight. A man who had been delivering American secrets to the KGB for 4 years was now being given access to even more sensitive material. And yet, the warning signs were everywhere, visible to anyone who cared to look. Rick Ames was living far, far beyond his means. Not slightly beyond. Not in a, maybe he got an inheritance way, but in a manner so extravagant that it should have triggered immediate investigation. In 1989, he and Rosario purchased a house in Arlington, Virginia for $540,000. Cash. Not financed. Cash. A CIA officer earning a government salary of roughly $60,000 a year bought a $500,000 house with cash. He drove a brand new Jaguar. He wore expensive clothes. He charged thousands of dollars on multiple credit cards. His domestic phone bills alone ran to hundreds of dollars a month, and he had the house extensively renovated. He bought furniture, electronics, jewelry. When colleagues asked about the money, Ames offered a vague story about Rosario's family having substantial resources in Colombia. Some people accepted this explanation. Some were skeptical but said nothing. The CIA's internal security apparatus, which had a formal responsibility to investigate employees who displayed unexplained wealth, essentially looked the other way. This was, in retrospect, a failure of almost inconceivable proportions. There were other red flags besides the money. Ames had a history of security violations. Earlier in his career, he had left a briefcase on a New York subway train, a briefcase containing classified materials. On another occasion, he had failed to properly account for expenses in ways that suggested financial irregularities. He had a well-documented drinking problem. He had been involved in an extramarital affair with a foreign national. Any one of these red flags, in a properly functioning security environment, should have triggered a serious review of his clearances. Together, they painted a portrait of a man who was either catastrophically unsuited for his position or actively hostile to the values of the institution he served. Both things were true. Back in Washington, Ames adapted his tradecraft to the operational environment. Rather than meeting his handlers in person, which was riskier in the American capital, he shifted to using dead drops, prearranged locations where he would leave packages of classified documents, and his KGB handlers would later retrieve them, leaving payment in exchange. The dead drop locations were scattered around Washington and the surrounding suburbs. Some were in parks, some were in quiet residential streets. And one of the most crucial signaling methods he used was absurdly simple: a chalk mark on a mailbox. There was a particular mailbox at the corner of 37th Street and R Street in Northwest Washington, a completely unremarkable postal collection box on an ordinary residential street. When Ames needed to signal his handlers that he was ready for a meeting or a dead drop exchange, he would walk past that mailbox and make a chalk mark on it. When the KGB officers driving past on their normal surveillance routes saw the chalk mark, they knew the message. Rick has something for us. The signal worked. For years, it worked perfectly. Today, that very mailbox, removed from its corner and preserved as a historical artifact, sits on display at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., a quiet monument to the audacity of the most destructive mole in CIA history. The payments kept coming. By May 1989, Ames had received over $1.8 million from the KGB. An additional $900,000 had been set aside for him in a Moscow bank account. By the time he was arrested in 1994, the total value of his compensation, cash, real estate, goods, and services, exceeded $2.7 million, making him the highest-paid American spy in history. The KGB was getting extraordinary value for their investment. By the early 1990s, Ames had compromised approximately 100 CIA intelligence operations, virtually the entire American human intelligence apparatus, against the Soviet Union and its successor states. The mole investigation sputtered forward through the late 1980s and early 1990s, but with agonizing slowness. There were too many suspects. The investigators were working with incomplete information. The KGB's disinformation campaign had successfully directed attention toward the Warrenton Training Center for months. And there was a profound institutional reluctance within the CIA, a culture of denial that resisted the conclusion that the problem was internal. The prevailing attitude in many quarters was that the losses had to have some other explanation. Bad tradecraft by the assets themselves, perhaps, or a technical compromise, or leaks from another service. But the losses kept coming. Even in the early 1990s, after the Soviet Union had collapsed and the KGB had been reorganized into the Russian FSB and SVR, Ames continued to pass secrets, now to Russian intelligence rather than Soviet. His handlers changed, the organizational structures changed, but the basic relationship remained intact. The Russians continued to pay him. He continued to deliver. In 1991, a crucial breakthrough began when the CIA and FBI started examining the finances of everyone who had had access to the compromised operations. This was, in retrospect, the methodology that should have been applied from the beginning. When investigators began looking carefully at the financial records of CIA officers who matched the profile of the mole, they found something that should have been blindingly obvious years earlier. Rick Ames, a mid-level intelligence officer earning a standard government salary, appeared to have spent well over $1.4 million in the 5 years since the first wave of compromises in 1985. The money was everywhere, in his house, his car, his credit card records, his renovation receipts. By May 1993, the FBI had opened a formal investigation specifically targeting Aldrich Ames. The investigation was intensive and meticulous. FBI special agents and investigative specialists placed Ames under round-the-clock physical surveillance. They monitored his movements, photographed his meetings, tracked his communications. They obtained court authorization to search his house while he was away, and what they found was damning: documents and other materials that directly linked him to Russian intelligence. The critical piece of evidence came on October 13, 1993. Surveillance agents watching Ames observed him walk to the mailbox at 37th and R Streets in Northwest Washington, the same mailbox he had been using for years, and make a chalk mark on it. They photographed him doing it. The chalk mark was the signal. It confirmed, beyond reasonable doubt, that Aldrich Ames was communicating with Russian intelligence. But investigators wanted more. They wanted to catch him in the act of delivering material to build the most airtight possible case. The next month, the surveillance paid off spectacularly. In November 1993, FBI agents following Ames observed him traveling to Bogota, Colombia, ostensibly to visit Rosario's family, a trip that had legitimate cover. But surveillance confirmed that during the Bogota visit, Ames met with a Russian intelligence officer. The espionage network was visible, documented, photographed. The FBI now had what it needed. But there was an urgent complication. The CIA, as part of Ames's normal duties, had scheduled him for an upcoming official trip to Moscow. If Ames arrived in Moscow while under investigation for espionage, he might not come back. He might defect. He might simply disappear under Russian protection, spending the rest of his life in comfortable exile, while the United States was denied the chance to prosecute him and, crucially, debrief him about the full extent of the damage he had caused. The decision was made. They had to arrest him before he could leave. The morning of February 21, 1994, was cold and clear in suburban Arlington, Virginia. President's Day. Aldrich Ames had no reason to expect anything out of the ordinary. He had been a mole for nearly 9 years. He had never been caught. His lifestyle had never been seriously questioned. He had been passing classified information to the Soviets and then the Russians for the better part of a decade, and the full weight of American law enforcement had never come close to touching him. He got into his Jaguar, backed out of his driveway in his expensive Arlington neighborhood, and headed towards CIA headquarters in Langley, just as he had done hundreds of times before. He never arrived. FBI agents had positioned vehicles along the route. As Ames's Jaguar moved down the street, FBI cars moved in from multiple directions, boxing him in, bringing his vehicle to a halt. Agents converged on the car with weapons drawn. Aldrich Ames was ordered out of his vehicle. He was told he was under arrest on charges of espionage. At the same moment, at the house he had paid for in cash with KGB money, other FBI agents were arresting Rosario Ames. Rick Ames's reaction, by some accounts, was one of almost surreal calm. He reportedly claimed, initially, that it was all a mistake, that there had been some misunderstanding. This was a lie he would not be able to maintain for long. Within the FBI's holding facility, as agents began walking through the evidence they had assembled, the chalk marks, the dead drops, the Colombian meeting, the financial records, the weight of it became undeniable. And Aldrich Ames, career intelligence officer, Soviet mole, betrayer of at least 10 people to their deaths, began to talk. The legal proceedings moved with relative speed. On April 28, 1994, both Aldrich Ames and Rosario Ames appeared in federal court and entered guilty pleas. The agreed-upon statement of facts entered into the record. At that hearing provided extraordinary detail about the espionage activities, the meetings in Washington, Vienna, Bogota, and Caracas, the dead drops, the chalk marks, the payments. Ames acknowledged that as of May 1989, he had already received over $1.8 million from the KGB, with another $900,000 waiting for him in Moscow. Aldrich Ames was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would never walk free again, while Rosario Ames, who had been aware of and participated in the financial side of the espionage, helping to manage the money, aware of its source, was sentenced to 63 months in prison. She served her sentence and was released in 1999, after which she and the couple's son, Paul, returned to Colombia. As part of his plea agreement, Ames cooperated with debriefing sessions conducted by CIA and FBI analysts. These debriefings were extensive and extraordinarily valuable, but also, in many ways, deeply disturbing. Ames described in clinical, matter-of-fact terms how he had identified the assets he was going to betray, how he had packaged the documents, how he had signaled his handlers, how he had spent the money. He was unabashed about his motives. There was no ideology, no political conviction, no moral framework of any kind. And he had done it for money. He had done it because he wanted a house and a car and a lifestyle that his salary couldn't provide. He had done it knowing with absolute certainty that the people he was naming would almost certainly be killed. They died, said CIA Director James Woolsey, speaking of the executed assets, because this warped, murdering traitor wanted a bigger house and a Jaguar. Woolsey resigned from his position the following year, in part because of the congressional outrage over the CIA's failure to detect Ames for so long. The full accounting of the damage Aldrich Ames caused to American intelligence was, and remains, classified in many of its details. But what is publicly known is staggering. At the time of his arrest, investigators assessed that he had compromised approximately 100 CIA intelligence operations. He had revealed the identities of every Soviet and Russian national working as a CIA or FBI informant that he knew about, which, given his position, was most of them. At least 10 people were executed as a direct result of his betrayals. Others were arrested and imprisoned. Others were converted by the KGB into double agents who fed false information back to the Americans, compounding the deception. Among those who died, General Dmitry Polyakov, betrayed by Ames, executed in 1988 after 2 years of interrogation. 20 years of service to American intelligence ended by a bullet. Adolf Tolkachev, a Soviet defense scientist who had been known to the CIA as the billion-dollar spy for the extraordinary technical intelligence he provided about Soviet radar and weapon systems, arrested and executed. Oleg Gordievsky, one of the most senior KGB officers ever recruited by British intelligence, was fortunate. His handlers managed to spirit him out of the Soviet Union before the KGB could arrest him, and he lived in exile in Britain. But even Gordievsky's case bore Ames's fingerprints. Ames had provided information that led the KGB to put Gordievsky under surveillance, very nearly costing the British their most valuable Soviet asset. The strategic consequences were immense. For the entire period of Ames's espionage, American intelligence was operating in the dark, literally blind, inside the Soviet Union. But the CIA's human intelligence network, built over decades at enormous expense and extraordinary personal risk to the people who ran it, had been effectively destroyed. Decisions made by American presidents, secretaries of state, and military commanders based on intelligence assessments were being made on the basis of a picture of Soviet intentions and capabilities that had been stripped of its most valuable components. And the KGB, fully aware of the source and extent of the damage they had inflicted, was feeding the CIA carefully crafted disinformation to fill the void. The Ames case forced a reckoning within the CIA that was, by turns, agonizing, embarrassing, and overdue. How had this happened? How had a mediocre, alcoholic, and financially reckless CIA officer, a man who had been flagged multiple times over the course of his career for poor performance, security violations, and unexplained wealth, been allowed to retain his clearances, his access, and his position for 31 years, including 9 years during which he was actively betraying the agency to the KGB? The answers that emerged from the post-arrest investigations and from the Senate Select Committee's exhaustive review were damning. The CIA had a culture that prioritized operational activity over internal security. Counterintelligence was chronically underfunded, understaffed, and undervalued. The polygraph, the lie detector test that was supposed to be one of the agency's primary security tools, had failed utterly with Ames. He had passed multiple polygraphs during his years as a mole, largely by following advice from his KGB handlers about how to calm his physiological responses. The financial monitoring systems that should have flagged his unexplained wealth were not functioning. The internal reporting mechanisms that should have escalated the concerns expressed in those eyes-only memoranda about his drinking were not working. The Senate Committee's final report concluded that the CIA had missed at least 9 specific opportunities to identify Ames as a potential spy before 1993. These included his unexplained wealth, his security violations, his performance problems, and the simple, logical conclusion that should have followed from a basic analysis of who had access to all the compromised operations. The failure was not one of individual incompetence, though individual incompetence certainly played a role, but of a systemic culture that was deeply resistant to confronting the possibility that the enemy might be among them. In the aftermath, the CIA implemented sweeping reforms. Background financial checks were strengthened. Polygraph procedures were revised. A new counterintelligence center was established with enhanced resources and authority. The FBI's role in monitoring CIA employees for espionage was expanded. These reforms were real and significant, but they couldn't bring back the dead. Aldrich Ames spent the rest of his life in federal prison. He was held at various facilities over the decades. The U.S. Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. Later, the Federal Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland. He gave occasional interviews over the years, speaking with a detached, almost academic quality about his own betrayal. He was never remorseful in the way one might hope a mass murderer would be. He rationalized, He contextualized. He seemed to view himself as a participant in a morally ambiguous game, a man who had made a rational calculation about his self-interest and executed it with reasonable competence until the moment he was caught. He spoke about his belief, formed during years of handling Soviet assets for the CIA, that the entire business of human intelligence was fundamentally corrupt, that the CIA recruited agents through a combination of manipulation, exploitation, and false promises, and that the agents themselves were often motivated by the same base self-interest that had motivated him. He seemed to feel that this view of the intelligence world somehow mitigated his own actions, that if everyone was betraying everyone else, his betrayal was merely one more transaction in a marketplace of secrets. This argument, such as it is, collapses upon contact with the faces of the people who died. Dmitry Polyakov believed in something when he risked his life for 20 years to provide intelligence to the United States. The people who ran the networks Ames destroyed believed in something. Their families, their children, the colleagues who never knew what happened to them. They were not abstractions in a geopolitical chess match. They were human beings, and they were dead. Aldrich Hazen Ames died on January 5, 2026, at the Federal Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland. He was 84 years old. He had served 32 years of his life sentence. His cause of death was not immediately released. He died, as he had lived for the last 3 decades of his life, in a federal prison, having betrayed his country, his colleagues, and the men and women who trusted the United States with their lives. The story of Aldrich Ames is, at one level, a story about greed, about a man who chose money over conscience, over duty, over the lives of others. But it is also a story about institutions and about the dangers that arise when institutions allow warning signs to go unheeded, when culture overwhelms oversight, when the assumption that one of us cannot be a traitor becomes a shield behind which a traitor hides. The KGB code-named Ames Kolokol, the Russian word for bell. It is a fitting name. And the bell rang for 9 years inside the Central Intelligence Agency. And for 9 years, the people who should have heard it didn't listen. When they finally did, when the FBI made its move on that cold February morning in 1994, the damage was already done, irreversible, measured not in lost files or compromised operations, but in human lives. The International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., still displays that ordinary mailbox from the corner of 37th and R Streets, the mailbox where a chalk mark meant that more secrets were on their way to Moscow. It is a small, mundane object, a blue metal box, the kind you can find on any street corner in any American city. But look at it long enough, and you can almost see the chalk mark still there, a thin white line drawn by a man who decided, one spring morning in 1985, that his comfort was worth more than the lives of the people who trusted him. He rang the bell, and people died. The legacy of Aldrich Ames continues to shape American intelligence practice to this day. The reforms implemented after his arrest, the enhanced financial monitoring, the strengthened counterintelligence protocols, the more rigorous vetting procedures, were directly responsible for identifying subsequent moles in the intelligence community, including FBI agent Robert Hanssen, arrested in 2001 after his own 15-year career as a Soviet and Russian spy. The lessons learned from the Ames case, written in the blood of at least 10 people, became the foundation of a more vigilant, more paranoid, and, eventually, more secure intelligence apparatus. But the fundamental vulnerability that Ames exploited, the human vulnerability, the weakness that comes from trusting people too much or too little, from allowing institutional culture to override individual judgment, from assuming that the people inside our most secure organizations are somehow immune to the pressures and temptations that drive ordinary human beings. that vulnerability can never be fully closed, because it is not a technical flaw or a procedural gap. It is the condition of being human, of being mortal, of being susceptible to fear and greed and desperation, and the terrible logic of having crossed a line from which you cannot step back. Rick Ames crossed that line on April 16, 1985, when he walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington with an envelope and a request for $50,000. He crossed it again 6 weeks later, when he brought 5 to 7 pounds of documents to a lunch meeting and handed over the names of every man and woman he could identify who was risking their life to keep America's intelligence networks alive. He crossed it in Rome, in those late-night meetings reeking of vodka. He crossed it every time he made a chalk mark on a mailbox, every time he loaded a dead drop, every time he cashed a check drawn on a KGB account. He crossed it, and they paid him, and the bell kept ringing, and the people on the other side of the world kept dying. And for 9 long years, no one in one of the most powerful intelligence organizations in human history noticed, or cared, or did anything about it. Until finally, one morning in 1994, the FBI did. So this has been the story of Aldrich Ames, the man the KGB called Kolokol, the bell. A reminder that the most dangerous enemy is not the one who attacks from outside, but the one who is already inside, who knows all your secrets because they are his secrets too, who shakes your hand every morning and smiles, and who at night makes marks on mailboxes in the dark.